Good morning. How are you guys today? Everyone read chapter 35 in U.S. history. So let's talk about what you read and what you learned. And John, what did you read?
Obviously, before a deaf student comes in, being able to think about placement of where the student might be in your classroom would be an important thing to think about. And this is something that you can discuss with the interpreter beforehand, or as the student comes in on the first day, taking that opportunity to meet the student and find out what works best for that individual student. Where do they like to sit? Where do they have full visual access? That visual access is really what's key for that student, being able to see either the board or whatever visuals you have, as well as the interpreter and as well as the teacher.
We want you to have a relationship with your deaf student. That means you need to look at them when they are communicating with you, regardless of the interpreter who is speaking what the deaf student is trying to communicate. So while it might be natural to look at the interpreter because they're the one speaking to you, it's important to look directly at your deaf student so you can begin to develop that relationship.
If a teacher is able to look at me when they're talking, if they're looking at the interpreter, I feel ignored and I feel unimportant. So it's always nice, I feel much better when the teacher looks directly at me instead of that feeling of unfairness if they're just communicating with the interpreter. I prefer to have direct communication with the interpreter where I can watch the person who's communicating with me and then look at the interpreter. But I always want the hearing person to direct their question directly to me.
It's a little awkward at the beginning, but the more you work with a deaf student, you'll realize that it's a smooth, simple process. If you just hang on for a minute, wait while they get the information from the interpreter, and the student will look at you to respond back when they're replying to you.
I'd like for teachers to know that deaf students aren't dumb. You know, we don't need to be helped. We don't need to have other students help us with things. That's not necessary. Just treat us as equal to our hearing peers. It doesn't matter that we're deaf. Just make sure that you are respecting the deafness and culture. And sometimes you have to just wait to ask through the interpreter, and that's okay.
We like to talk about what an interpreter does and does not do. Often, because there is another adult in the classroom, it's easy to rely on them for behavior corrections or running errands or things like that. We like to teach teachers that interpreters are only there to facilitate communication. While it would be helpful to have another adult run and go grab your copies, it's difficult for the interpreter to do that so that they can continue to interpret for the student and what's happening in the classroom.
We see this a lot where teachers, they like to walk around their class. They like to be with each of the students and engage with each of the students. And as they move, we will see teachers occasionally step in front of the interpreter. And at that point, you'll see deaf students going like this, or interpreter standing up, moving around. So just being aware that if you need to walk past the interpreter, it is totally fine to walk past the interpreter, but to just quickly move past the interpreter and not stop in the middle of where that line, the eyesight would be between the deaf student and the interpreter. I know some teachers, they don't like it when interpreters are standing right by them. That makes them a little bit uncomfortable. So it is fine to express with your interpreter, okay, if you're standing right by me side by side, I feel like I'm gonna hit you and I can't focus on my teaching. Express your feelings and your comfort as well.
I prefer for the interpreter to sit directly in front of me, but sometimes if the teacher's moving around, it's helpful for the interpreter to move close to the teacher as well so I can still see both. If there's bright light from behind or bright light from directly in front of me, then that makes it hard for me to see. I've had the experience of an interpreter moving in front of a window, and then it's hard for me to be able to see them and understand because I just get the outline of them with the sun shining brightly through the window behind them. Depending on the situation, I'd like teachers to know that if I'm watching a video, you know, if the class is watching a video and it's fully dark, it's better to leave the lights slightly dim. As far as closed captioning, I had a history teacher who was very helpful and would try to find the videos, make sure that the videos had captions that worked. I prefer to watch a movie with closed captions, and that's able to help my brain understand exactly what's being said in the video, so that's my preference. It's helpful for me to have captions and the interpreter as well, and that makes it easier for me to fully understand in my own language the English of the closed captions.
So a note taker is an IEP accommodation that a deaf student can have. It can be another student in the classroom that just makes photocopies of the notes they're already taking for themselves.
Very often deaf students can't take notes at the same time as they're watching. They can only understand information coming from one source at a time. So they can choose to watch the teacher and pay attention, or they can choose to write notes. But as a teacher, to be aware that when that student looks down to write something, anything that you're saying is going to be lost.
Particularly with math, it can be difficult to be able to watch the interpreter and see the teacher's explanations on the board. Trying to catch 4 things at once, that level of multitasking is just impossible. So in the past, I had a math teacher who would give me the notes written out that would show me the fractions, all of the math equations. He would hand that to me every day when I entered the classroom, and that was really helpful for me because that meant that I could just focus on understanding the math concepts themselves. Sometimes I like to have a note taker if there's things that I keep missing because I'm watching the interpreter. Sometimes that's helpful.
The interpreters are trained to convey everything as part of their interpretation. Sometimes interpreters get tired in what they do. It's difficult to interpret. Often we will have 2 interpreters in a classroom if it's a difficult topic, and they will take turns interpreting to make sure that they are processing things correctly as well as not omitting any important information. So be assured that your interpreter is not dropping the ball and leaving large chunks of information out.
Educational interpreters follow a code of ethics, and we're ethically bound to not omit or add information in any interpretation we're given. There are a lot of times in educational interpreting where a teacher might turn and say something like, "Oh, don't tell the deaf student this right now." Just know if you say that, we ethically have to still share that information, and so our interpretation will include, "Oh, please don't tell that student this right now."
So who can tell me where the tea party happened?
San Francisco.
Wait. One person at a time. John?
It doesn't happen very often, but sometimes an interpreter will get tripped up if there's people talking all at once. And it can be helpful for a teacher to set a rule that says, you have to raise your hand before you answer, because that can be hard for the interpreter.
One of the things that will be really helpful this school year is if I can get your materials in advance so I can prep. Kind of in a similar way you prep for your lessons, I kind of need to prep for my interpretation.
We love for our interpreters to be as prepared as possible for the things that will be talked about in class as well as in the school, assemblies, different activities like that. Interpreters will come to you and ask for the materials that you will be covering the next week or even the next day to make sure they are prepared to interpret things as accurately as possible. We understand that sometimes there are last-minute changes or things change in your lesson plans on the fly. That is fine. The interpreter is really your ally and works collaboratively with you to make sure that the deaf student is successful in your classroom.
How do I approach discipline with this student? So my response to that teacher is always, what would you do for the other students in your classroom? And that's how you should approach discipline with your deaf student. Deaf students can be held to the same standards as the other kids in your classroom for behavior and expectation to follow rules. Ask if you have an issue or a conflict with that interpreter, address it with them. We're professionals and we know how to work with people, and we can change our approaches, what we need to do. There's always an opportunity to go to supervisors, but I think overall the big picture that I would look at is we're all here for the deaf student and for the students in the classroom.
For a deaf student, it's almost guaranteed, if they have an interpreter in your classroom, that they will be on an individualized education plan, an IEP. The interpreter then becomes part of that IEP team, and they have valuable feedback on the communication needs of that deaf student in your classroom, as well as information about deaf cultural practices and other things related to the deaf student and their language needs that the interpreter, as a direct communicator, is maybe picking up on, that they can then share with the IEP team. We love for our interpreters to be a part of the IEP team so that they can give that feedback and communication about what's happening with the deaf student in your classroom.
Thank you to the school administrators, teachers, and interpreters for watching this video.